What if the fall of a great empire didn't sound like a crash, but more like the slow creak of old doors that were never oiled again? Tonight's journey begins with Rome, not the Rome of glory, but the Rome that lingered. The one where officials kept stamping papers no one read, where markets waited for goods that never arrived, and where soldiers guarded borders that quietly stopped existing. This isn't a story of battles. It's a story of slowness of laws still written in Latin. No one understood anymore, and roads that faded beneath the feet of fewer and fewer travelers. If this kind of quiet unraveling intrigues you, you're in the right place. And if you'd like more slow, thoughtful walks through history, you can follow along by subscribing only if it feels right to you. Also, I'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight and what time the past has reached you. Now, settle in. We're about to explore how the strongest empire in the West wasn't brought down by a sword, but by the ordinary weight of forgotten things. Long before the fall of the Western Roman Empire was marked in textbooks, before emperors were dethroned and barbarians took up residence in once gilded halls, the daily machinery of empire began to slip not in politics, nor on the battlefield, but in the docks, the ledgers, and the sacks of grain that failed to arrive. Grain was the empire's quiet lifeblood. It wasn't glamorous, but it fed the cities, especially Rome. For centuries, enormous fleets carried wheat and barley from Egypt and North Africa across the Mediterranean to Ostia and Portus, the twin ports feeding the capital. From there, miles of well-worn roads and carefully built warehouses moved grain to bakeries, army depots, and public granaries. For many Roman citizens, especially the urban poor, the state's grain distribution, the annona, was not just a privilege, it was survival. Administering this system required a vast network of seemingly dull officials. The praefectus annoni oversaw the whole operation, but beneath him worked hundreds of clerks, scribes, accountants, and port inspectors. They measured shipments, recorded quantities, and maintained contracts. They worked quietly in backrooms with tally sticks, wax tablets, and rolls of papyrus that detailed every step from harvest to loaf. Their names rarely survived history, but for decades, their accuracy and persistence kept the system afloat. By the mid-4th century CE, small disturbances began to surface. First, a few delayed ships, then a few months of spoiled reserves. Dock workers at Ostia noted that fewer vessels were unloading from Alexandria than usual. Letters between regional governors and the central administration in Ravenna began to reflect mild concern. There was no panic. Rome had weathered shortages before, but something was changing. Piracy increased along the North African coast, where many grain ships departed. Some attacks were petty, just local raiders seeking supplies. Others were more serious, involving deserters, rogue garrisons, or groups once loosely allied with Rome who had grown disillusioned. Each disruption was small, but the grain supply relied on consistency. Rome wasn't designed for famine. It was designed for abundance. In the offices of the grain clerks, the mood grew tense. Ship manifests began arriving late or not at all. Port tallies didn't match warehouse records. In one surviving report dated to 371 CE, a port officer in Ostia reported that 2/3 of an expected shipment had failed to arrive. He added, with bureaucratic restraint, that he had adjusted allocations proportionally. This meant cutting rations, not officially, but in practice. Local bakeries began receiving flour late or in reduced amounts. Some resorted to stretching, loaves with husk or cheaper grain substitutes. Others bribed officials to maintain their share. In the poorer districts of Rome, queues at bread distribution centers grew longer, and fights occasionally broke out. Not riots, just the quiet tension of need. The empire didn't declare a crisis. That wasn't how things worked. Instead, administrators sent more orders, more inspectors, more letters. A prefect in Ravenna might write to a port governor in Carthage urging him to increase output, unaware that local harvests had been poor due to Nile irregularities or a shortage of labor. And when the grain didn't come, the clerks rewrote the numbers. One former official, Gaius Varenius, whose marginal notes survive on a preserved wax tablet, summed it up in a few carved lines. Allocations must match expectations, adjust figures accordingly. It wasn't deception in the modern sense. It was a habit of preserving the image of control, even when reality had shifted. By 380 CE, the effects had reached more than just Rome. Provincial towns that once received grain indirectly from overflow stocks saw deliveries disappear altogether. In parts of Gaul and Hispania, where local agriculture was inconsistent, this meant going without. Rural administrators noted an increase in petitions for food relief and higher grain prices in open markets. These were signs of strain, but they were not yet labelled as systemic. In the countryside, landowners with private grain stores began to fill the gap, offering bread or barley to workers and villagers, sometimes as charity, often as a tool of control. Small-scale economies developed with unofficial grain deals, bypassing the formal system entirely. For the first time in generations, people were relying on their neighbours more than on the empire. Meanwhile, in the records kept by the Annona officials, the format remained unchanged. They continued to record the expected tonnage of wheat. They sent out allocations based on models created decades before. And when discrepancies arose, they added footnotes about weather, pirates, or delayed shipments. But the trend was clear. Each year, the numbers tilted further from the truth. Ship captains began demanding more money or better protection. Some stopped making the voyage entirely. In Egypt, local administrators increasingly funneled grain toward private trade, selling it directly in Alexandria rather than risking loss at sea. By 390 CE, the state's confidence in Egypt as a reliable source was quietly eroding, though no proclamation acknowledged this. What made the situation so difficult to correct was how familiar it all felt. Rome had always experienced occasional shortages. There had always been pirates, always some corruption. What was different now was the persistence, a slow layering of failure over failure. Like dust accumulating on a marble floor, it happened too gradually to notice. And so, the empire adjusted, quietly. Bread became smaller. Rations became informal. Records became creative. The people adapted, because they always had. But the mechanisms that once sustained a vast urban population were cracking, and no one could admit it out loud. And still, the question remained. If the grain no longer flowed, how long could the illusion of Rome continue? As the Roman grain system faltered, it didn't bring immediate collapse. Instead, it redistributed power. Hunger, once a concern mostly confined to the edges of the empire, became a new kind of currency. Those who could provide food, whether officials, landlords, or enterprising traders, found themselves holding influence that rivaled senatorial rank. Quietly, steadily, the politics of survival replaced the politics of law. In the capital, the Annona continued its routine. Ledgers were filled, allocations were recorded, and ration centers maintained their queues. But the people who once depended entirely on state-provided grain began to notice inconsistencies. Some days the rations were smaller. Other days, deliveries didn't happen at all. Rumors circulated of grain being diverted, not by enemies, but by Rome's own administrators, struggling to prioritize one district over another. Wealthier families avoided the issue by tapping into private stores or arranging direct shipments from estates in Sicily, Africa, or southern Gaul. For everyone else, food became a negotiation. The local bakery, once a steady source of bread, now adjusted its hours depending on supply. Some stopped accepting imperial coin altogether, preferring bartered goods or precious metal. The effect spread to the countryside in sharper form. In many rural areas, especially those once tied to imperial granaries, a quiet shift began, from state-based loyalty to local dependence. Landowners who still had productive estates took on the roles the state once held. They fed local laborers. They offered seasonal grain stores in exchange for long-term labor contracts. Sometimes they gave freely. More often, they demanded loyalty, service, or even land pledges in return. A letter fragment preserved in Ravenna, written by a man named Flavius Severianus, a regional administrator in Etruria, describes this, dynamic, in careful prose. The people now look to Marcus Septimius, not because of law or rank, but because his cellars are full. When I visit the village, they bow to him first. Marcus Septimius, likely a local landholder, had become what many others did in this era, a food patron. These new figures weren't necessarily noble, nor even legally powerful, but they were essential. In a world where the grain from Alexandria no longer arrived on time, proximity to a man with sacks of barley was worth more than the approval of a distant governor. Urban elites, particularly in smaller cities across Gaul and Hispania, also adjusted their roles. Once engaged in civic life through donations to baths or theatres, they now invested in granaries, bread ovens, and guarded storage vaults. In some towns, records show that local magistrates were bypassed entirely during food crises in favour of wealthy traders or retired centurions with agricultural estates. In response to the food shortages, the imperial bureaucracy did not completely fail. It adapted in the only way it knew how: more decrees. Laws were passed attempting to fix grain prices, punish hoarders, and compel shipping compliance. 1. Edict from Emperor Honorius in 398 CE demanded that all North African grain shipments resume at pre-existing quotas, warning of penalties for disobedience. The problem was that the empire no longer had the leverage to enforce these laws. Governors were overextended, soldiers were underpaid, and local priorities often outweighed distant imperial commands. Even when grain was available, transportation became an issue. Roads had fallen into disrepair in many regions. Bridge tolls increased as local rulers began charging for maintenance. Merchants complained of brigands along routes once patrolled by imperial troops. The river transport system along the Tiber slowed considerably, not due to catastrophe, but from a simple reduction in upkeep. Each of these issues seemed minor on its own. Together, they created a sluggish, unreliable network. In response, communities took matters into their own hands. In Narbo, a coastal town in Gaul, a group of local merchants funded their own ship to fetch grain from Sardinia, bypassing imperial ports altogether. Records from a local monastery described the transaction. They hired a vessel, promised protection, and bartered with olive oil and wool instead of coin. The grain arrived late, but it arrived. This quiet privatization of logistics was neither planned nor sanctioned. It emerged from necessity. And over time, it eroded the empire's ability to control commerce. Rome's once centralized economy began to resemble a patchwork, informal, improvised, and increasingly local. Meanwhile, the role of the military in the food system shifted. Soldiers, who once received regular grain stipends, now found themselves foraging or relying on local officials to secure their rations. This eroded discipline. In frontier regions like the Rhine and Danube, there are accounts of auxiliary units accepting supplies from local chieftains or raiding nearby towns for grain, not in rebellion, but out of hunger. Loyalty, once secured by salary and food, became unpredictable. It was not that Rome had no food. Grain still grew in Africa, ships still sailed, bakeries still operated, but the consistency had vanished. And consistency, more than abundance, is what held the system together. In this environment, hunger did more than empty stomachs. It reshaped society. A family that once lived on daily bread from the imperial ration had to consider new options. A relative in the countryside, a patron willing to offer wheat in exchange for a son's service, a relocation to a smaller town where competition was less severe. For administrators, the situation meant compromise. Many quietly allowed barter systems to operate. Some accepted taxes in kind, grain, olive oil, wool, rather than currency. Others falsified delivery records to avoid panic or punishment. And a few simply disappeared from their posts, returning to family estates rather than preside over, a system they no longer believed in. Historians often struggle to capture the slowness of collapse. There are no heroic speeches in these records, no dramatic betrayals, just dull letters about missing shipments, tedious accounts of bread queues, and quiet resignations. But within these details, the shape of the empire changed. And as Rome's citizens adapted to these new realities, one question loomed over every ledger, every market stall, and every crumb of bread. What happens when the empire that once fed the world can no longer feed itself? By the early 5th century, the grain supply system that had once nourished the capital of the Western Roman Empire had become a shadow of itself. The great logistical engine, the ships, the ledgers, the depots, the clerks, still technically existed, but it had thinned, not vanished, not yet, but frayed so deeply that it was now more a ritual than a functioning system. People queued, because that's what had always been done. Clerks recorded shipments that hadn't arrived in months. The machinery turned, but the substance was gone. Rome itself, the ancient heart of the empire, was changing. Its population had declined. Once swelling with more than 1 million residents, the city now held perhaps a third of that. Entire neighborhoods sat half empty. Some fountains no longer flowed. Streets grew uneven from lack of repair. And among its poorest citizens, the dream of a state-fed loaf, the annona, still held a strange kind of loyalty. It was no longer dependable, but it was remembered. Those who had once received monthly distributions had, in many cases, shifted to more local means: family gardens, private trade, or assistance from landlords. But even then, many still made their way to the ration points in the hope that something might arrive. A loaf, a handful of grain, even just word of an incoming shipment. More often than not, they left with nothing. An anonymous chronicler in the early 400s wrote of Rome's urban poor: they wait for the grain as if it still flows. But the sea does not answer, and the docks are quiet. That quiet was perhaps the most telling sign of what had been lost. For centuries, the grain ships had docked daily, their sails dotting the horizon. The sound of unloading cargo, the shouting of porters, the rumble of carts heading inland, all were part of Rome's daily rhythm. Their absence was not loud, it was silence. At the administrative level, attempts were still made to restore the system. In 409 CE, during the first siege of Rome by Alaric and the Visigoths, the desperate Senate promised grain in exchange for peace. Grain they didn't actually have. The city's elite offered up their own gold and silver to buy food from neighboring towns. The state, for all its grandeur, had no reserves. It could no longer guarantee bread. During the siege, starvation set in quickly. The urban population, already strained by years of under-delivery, now faced complete isolation. Pets were eaten. Grass was boiled. Some accounts speak of darker measures, though many were likely exaggerated by later writers. What is certain is that Rome, once master of logistics, now could not feed its own. After the siege was lifted, the damage remained. Rome's aura of security was broken, and the annona, the symbol of the empire's promise to care for its citizens, never recovered. There were still attempts to revive parts of the system, especially under the short reign of Emperor Majorian, 457 to 461 CE, who tried to restore state control over grain shipments. But by then, the infrastructure had decayed too far. Warehouses were abandoned. Contracts went unhonored. The ports of North Africa, now controlled by the Vandals, no longer shipped grain to the west. In fact, they often raided what little remained. The empire's eastern half, centered in Constantinople, managed to preserve its food systems longer. The grain fleets from Egypt still served the eastern capital, and its bureaucracy, though strained, remained intact. But the west was adrift. Even as imperial officials continued to issue edicts, their reach was narrow and their words slow to travel. In small towns across Gaul, Hispania, and Italy, a new kind of localism took root. Church bishops began to fill the role once held by imperial administrators. Inscriptions from the period refer to bishops feeding the poor, organizing grain relief, and maintaining granaries. They became not only spiritual leaders, but also stewards of physical survival. In a letter from Bishop Faustus of Ries in Gaul, he writes, "The people do not ask whether grain comes from the empire or the church, only that it comes, and that it is enough. In some ways, this was the beginning of the medieval world, not marked by a sudden end to Rome, but by the gradual transformation of authority. Where once the state had promised sustenance, now it was the church, or the landowner, or the village council. The imperial system had built the habit of dependence. Its collapse left a void that others slowly filled. Among historians, there has long been a debate. Did Rome fall, or did it fade? The answer lies in places like the empty storehouses of Ostia, or in the long disconnected ledgers of the Prefectus Annoni, where shipments continued to be recorded long after the grain had stopped flowing. The most fascinating thing is how long the idea of the system outlived the system itself. In city councils across Italy, long after the empire had lost the power to enforce them, discussions continued around grain allocations, dock assignments, and ration planning. They were talking to ghosts. But the ritual remained. Even in the early medieval period, centuries after the Western Empire's official end, towns would occasionally refer to Annona-style distributions, local grain allotments, inspired by Roman practice. It had become more than policy. It was memory, a civic reflex rooted in a vanished order. By then, of course, the empire had become something else entirely, a matter of stories, ruins, and names carved into fading marble. But in the minds of those who had waited in line for bread, who had believed that Rome would always provide, the memory was real. They remembered the ships that once came. They remembered the scales, the ledgers, the smell of fresh loaves at dawn. And they remembered when the grain stopped coming. In the popular imagination, the fall of the Western Roman Empire is a story of soldiers, invaders, and collapsing walls. But there's another version, one written not in swords, but in ink. One shaped by men who never fought a battle, never issued a speech, and never appeared in a triumphal arch. These were the bureaucrats, the scribes, accountants, legal copyists, and tax recorders who made Rome function long after its glory had faded. They are almost invisible in the historical record, not because they were unimportant, but because they were ordinary. And in Rome's long decline, ordinariness became its own kind of resistance. It's difficult to say how many bureaucrats worked in the Western Empire during its final centuries, but the number was not small. From Ravenna to Carthage, from Mediolanum, modern Milan, to the provincial towns of Gaul, hundreds of scribal offices quietly operated. Each had its own stack of clay seals, its own worn desks, its own set of record books that needed copying and updating. In these offices, tax registers were adjusted, grain shipments documented, and legal decrees copied for circulation, all with the assumption that the empire still held. One such man, known only through a handful of surviving documents, was Quintus Aelius Fortunatus, a notarius, a record keeper, stationed in the city of Aquileia. A faded wax tablet, discovered in the ruins of an old administrative building, bears his name in shorthand, appended to a set of livestock tax filings. The year was 413 CE. The empire was already being carved at the edges. Aquileia itself had recently survived a siege. And yet, the tax rolls continued. These men understood systems. They knew how to calculate land values, interpret census returns, and manage the delicate balance between collection and revolt. Most were literate, disciplined, and modestly paid. Few were rich, fewer still were remembered, yet it was they who made the Roman world legible, and they continued to do so, long after the rest of the world had stopped believing in its structure. The day-to-day life of a Roman bureaucrat in the 5th century was not one of emergency. It was one of inertia. He would rise early, often before sunrise, and enter a modest office, sometimes in a formal curial building, sometimes in the repurposed home of a former noble. The office would be cold in winter, stifling in summer, but orderly. Rolls of parchment and papyrus lined the shelves. Wax tablets waited for reuse. The tools of empire were still in reach. One clerk would be assigned to transcribe edicts arriving from Ravenna or Constantinople. Another might tabulate the grain receipts from a provincial storehouse. A third might audit the tax payments from local estates, checking them against land survey records, many of which were already out of date. The pace was steady, repetitive. The empire was not in flames. It was drowning in forms. Some officials tried to adapt. One decree issued by a mid-level administrator in southern Gaul in 417 CE recommended simplifying the land tax code due to diminished staff and reduced returns. It was never implemented. Tradition weighed heavily. The forms, the processes, the expectations, all were inherited from earlier generations, from a time when Rome's population was larger, its roads maintained, and its authority unchallenged. The persistence of these practices wasn't delusion, it was duty. Many bureaucrats had spent their entire lives serving a system they believed in. For them, updating a tax register was not a futile task, it was a reaffirmation of order. Even as towns shrank and provinces slipped from imperial grasp, the ledgers were still updated, stamped, and filed away. Some offices preserved instructions for dealing with irregularities. If a shipment of olive oil failed to arrive, a clerk might mark it expected, delayed, then resubmit the form the following month. If a census return showed empty villages, the numbers would be estimated based on older records. And if a town failed to submit taxes, a letter would be sent. Gently worded at first, then firmer. The empire's bureaucracy had developed over centuries to accommodate temporary shortages, missed deadlines, and occasional instability. It was flexible, to a point, but by the late 400s flexibility had turned into denial. Offices in Italy were still issuing grain quotas for towns that no longer existed. In Hispania, duplicated tax notices were sent to areas overrun by Visigothic federates. And in Gaul, some scribes began writing in both Latin and local dialects, unsure which would reach the intended audience. Even as they wrote, some officials must have known the system was failing, but it is likely that many believed they were buying time. That order, once maintained, would regenerate itself. After all, Rome had faced crises before, civil wars, assassinations, plagues, and still recovered. Why should this be different? There is something deeply human in that kind of persistence. It wasn't arrogance, it was habit. To continue writing, filing, stamping, and recording, even as the foundation crumbled beneath their feet, was a form of quiet resistance. To admit that the system was over would be to surrender not just a career, but a worldview. In many cases, the end came not through dramatic events but through silence. One day, the imperial courier stopped arriving. The office budget was no longer renewed. The ink ran out, and no replacement was sent. So the scribes stopped writing, not in protest, not in panic, but in resignation. What remains of their work is fragmentary, scraps of parchment, incomplete ledgers, marginal notes. But within these fragments is a portrait of decline, not as destruction, but as repetition without purpose. It is the sound of pens scratching away at scrolls no one would read, of wax tablets being smoothed and reused for the 50th time, of stamps being pressed into paper long after the seal had lost its meaning. And it raises a question that echoes across time. If the empire still keeps its records, does it still exist? In the popular imagination, the fall of the Western Roman Empire is a story of soldiers, invaders, and collapsing walls. But there's another version. One written not in swords, but in ink. One shaped by men who never fought a battle, never issued a speech, and never appeared in a triumphal arch. These were the bureaucrats, the scribes, accountants, legal copyists, and tax recorders who made Rome function long after its glory had faded. They are almost invisible in the historical record, not because they were unimportant, but because they were ordinary. And in Rome's long decline, ordinariness became its own kind of resistance. It's difficult to say how many bureaucrats worked in the Western Empire during its final centuries, but the number was not small. From Ravenna to Carthage, from Mediolanum, modern Milan, to the provincial towns of Gaul, hundreds of scribal offices quietly operated. Each had its own stack of clay seals, its own worn desks, its own set of record books that needed copying and updating. In these offices, tax registers were adjusted, grain shipments documented, and legal decrees copied for circulation, all with the assumption that the empire still held. One such man, known only through a handful of surviving documents, was Quintus Aelius Fortunatus, a notarius, a record keeper, stationed in the city of Aquileia. A faded wax tablet, discovered in the ruins of an old administrative building, bears his name in shorthand, appended to a set of livestock tax filings. The year was 413 CE. The empire was already being carved at the edges. Aquileia itself had recently survived a siege, and yet the tax rolls continued. These men understood systems. They knew how to calculate land values, interpret census returns, and manage the delicate balance between collection and revolt. Most were literate, disciplined, and modestly paid. Few were rich. Fewer still were remembered. Yet it was they who made the Roman world legible, and they continued to do so long after the rest of the world had stopped believing in its structure. The day-to-day life of a Roman bureaucrat in the 5th century was not one of emergency. It was one of inertia. He would rise early, often before sunrise, and enter a modest office, sometimes in a formal curial building, sometimes in the repurposed home of a former noble. The office would be cold in winter, stifling in summer, but orderly. Rolls of parchment and papyrus lined the shelves. Wax tablets waited for reuse. The tools of empire were still in reach. One clerk would be assigned to transcribe edicts arriving from Ravenna or Constantinople. Another might tabulate the grain receipts from a provincial storehouse. A third might audit the tax payments from local estates, checking them against land survey records, many of which were already out of date. The pace was steady, repetitive. The empire was not in flames. It was drowning in forms. Some officials tried to adapt. One decree issued by a mid-level administrator in southern Gaul in 417 CE recommended simplifying the land tax code due to diminished staff and reduced returns. It was never implemented. Tradition weighed heavily. The forms, the processes, the expectations, all were inherited from earlier generations, from a time when Rome's population was larger, its roads maintained, and its authority unchallenged. The persistence of these practices wasn't delusion, it was duty. Many bureaucrats had spent their entire lives serving a system they believed in. For them, updating a tax register was not a futile task. It was a reaffirmation of order. Even as towns shrank and provinces slipped from imperial grasp, the ledgers were still updated, stamped, and filed away. Some offices preserved instructions for dealing with irregularities. If a shipment of olive oil failed to arrive, a clerk might mark it expected, delayed, then resubmit the form the following month. If a census return showed empty villages, the numbers would be estimated based on older records. And if a Essek town failed to submit taxes, a letter would be sent, gently worded at first, then firmer. The empire's bureaucracy had developed over centuries to accommodate temporary shortages, missed deadlines, and occasional instability. It was flexible, to a point, but by the late 400s, flexibility had turned into denial. Officers in Italy were still issuing grain quotas for towns that no longer existed. In Hispania, duplicated tax notices were sent to areas overrun by Visigothic federates. And in Gaul, some scribes began writing in both Latin and local dialects, unsure which would reach the intended audience. Even as they wrote, some officials must have known the system was failing, but it is likely that many believed they were buying time. That order, once maintained, would regenerate itself. After all, Rome had faced crises before, civil wars, assassinations, plagues, and still recovered. Why should this be different? There is something deeply human in that kind of persistence. It wasn't arrogance, it was habit. To continue writing, filing, stamping, and recording, even as the foundation crumbled beneath their feet, was a form of quiet resistance. To admit that the system was over would be to surrender not just a career, but a worldview. In many cases, the end came not through dramatic events, but through silence. One day, the imperial courier stopped arriving. The office budget was no longer renewed. The ink ran out, and no replacement was sent. So the scribes stopped writing, not in protest, not in panic, but in resignation. What remains of their work is fragmentary. Scraps of parchment, incomplete ledgers, marginal notes. But within these fragments is a portrait of decline, not as destruction, but as repetition without purpose. It is the sound of pens scratching away at scrolls no one would read, of wax tablets being smoothed and reused for the 50th time, of stamps being pressed into paper long after the seal had lost its meaning. And it raises a question that echoes across time. If the empire still keeps its records, does it still exist? When the Western Roman Empire formally ended in 476 CE with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, there were no fireworks. No ruins exploded. No statues toppled. In fact, in many parts of the former empire, life continued much as before, especially in the administrative offices. Though political power shifted from emperors to warlords, from governors to bishops, from Ravenna to provincial strongmen, the habits of record-keeping persisted. The fall of the empire, at least to the men still working at their desks, felt more like a change in header formatting than the collapse of a world. Across Italy, Gaul, and Hispania, former imperial clerks continued doing what they had always done, writing letters, copying legal codes, filing tax receipts. Except now, the instructions came from new patrons, local rulers, barbarian kings, even bishops. In many cases, these new authorities adopted Roman bureaucratic structures wholesale. They saw their value. You didn't need to be Roman to appreciate the power of a well-organized tax base. In the city of Arles, for example, under the early Visigothic rule, Roman-style offices continued operating for decades after the supposed fall. Local notaries still used Latin titles. Official forms still followed Roman formatting. And clerks, some now working under Gothic names, still filed their records into old imperial archives. The empire, at least on paper, had not entirely gone away. One particularly fascinating fragment from southern Gaul, preserved in a monastery that later grew over a Roman civic building, details grain distributions from 481 CE. The document, scratched hastily into parchment and bound with an old imperial seal, refers to the allocations as a nona, the same term used for centuries. The recipient names, however, suggest a mix of Latin and Gothic ancestry. The old machine was being driven by new hands. In some cases, the illusion of continuity was deliberate. New kings, Odoacer in Italy, the Visigoths in Gaul, the Burgundians, in parts of the Alps, realized that presenting themselves as heirs to Rome lent legitimacy. So they retained Roman administrators when they could, relied on Latin-speaking scribes, and commissioned laws that mimicked Roman legal codes. This wasn't nostalgia, it was strategy. And for the bureaucrats themselves, this arrangement was oddly stabilizing. Their world had always been one of shifting emperors and distant orders. Whether the command came from a Roman general or a Gothic chieftain mattered less than whether the office was funded and the ink was restocked. In Ravenna, which remained a major administrative center for years after 476 CE, archival evidence shows that clerks continued to organize census information, landholding records, and legal decrees under the nominal oversight of the new regime. There's little sign of dramatic reform. What changed was not the work, but the authority behind it. Many former imperial officials quietly repositioned themselves as advisors, secretaries, or treasurers to post-Roman lords. Some found employment in church administration, which had begun to adopt Roman clerical methods. From tithe records to land surveys, the line between civil and ecclesiastical bureaucracy blurred. The church, rising in influence, became not only a spiritual body, but a logistical one. In the city of Milan, where the bishopric grew rapidly in wealth and power, surviving letters describe how scribes helped manage donations of farmland, coordinate local food relief, and organize correspondence between bishops and distant monasteries. These were the same tasks once done for governors. The parchment changed. The pens stayed the same. Yet even as these habits persisted, something else was quietly shifting: the meaning of the documents themselves. In the Roman world, paperwork had real power. An imperial order could move armies, reassign tax zones, or pardon debts. But as the empire's central authority disappeared, the force behind the writing faded. A tax record copied in 490 CE might still look like an imperial document. It might bear a seal, a signature, a tally. But whether anyone acted on it was another matter. This hollowing out of administrative meaning didn't happen overnight. For years, local officials still expected responses from former centers of power. Some continued to send reports to Ravenna or Rome, not knowing that the recipients had retired or disappeared. It was, in a sense, paperwork as ritual, not useless, just unmoored. And still, the scribes adapted. Some began keeping dual ledgers, one for the old system, one for the new. Others added clarifying marginalia: no reply from the central office, or request forwarded to local bishop instead. These notes, found in the margins of recovered documents, offer a quiet testimony to an age of uncertainty. In some regions, especially more remote provinces, Roman clerical habits blended with local traditions. In parts of Britain, post-Roman, settlements retained elements of Latin documentation alongside oral contracts. In North Africa, Berber-led polities occasionally used Roman-styled charters for land transfers. The handwriting might be clumsy, the Latin rough, but the shapes remained. It's worth noting that even the word bureaucracy has Roman roots. Bura for cloth, as in a writing desk covered in fabric, and kratin, meaning power. The idea that power could be expressed through written documents was one of Rome's most enduring legacies. And though the empire fell, that idea survived, embedded in churches, kingdoms, monasteries, and city councils. As late as the 6th century, under Theodoric the Ostrogoth, Italy saw a remarkable return to administrative stability. Theodoric, ruling in the name of the Eastern Roman Emperor, but acting independently, maintained Roman institutions and employed Roman officials. Cassiodorus, a senator and civil servant during this time, left behind volumes of letters, laws, and instructions that show just how thoroughly Roman-style governance persisted, despite the empire being, technically, gone. In one letter, Cassiodorus writes to a water official in Rome, instructing him to maintain the aqueducts with the same care as in earlier centuries. His tone is formal, respectful, and unmistakably Roman. It's as though nothing had changed, except that everything had. These final echoes of Roman bureaucracy speak to a broader truth. While governments may fall, habits endure. The act of organizing, recording, and filing, of bringing order to the chaos of human life through ink and page, does not vanish with emperors. The empire's flesh may have withered, but its handwriting remained. By the time the Western Roman Empire had vanished in name and law, its clerical DNA had already begun to graft itself onto the civilizations that came after it. In monastic scriptoria, in royal chanceries, in dusty town archives, the forms, styles, and rhythms of Roman record-keeping continued, long after the empire was no longer a political reality. In the early medieval period, particularly from the 6th to the 8th century, monks and local rulers across Europe still wrote with Roman tools. The cursus scripturae, the structured formulaic Latin style of official communication, persisted. Many scribes continued to sign documents with Roman flourishes, such as datum per manus, meaning given by my hand, a phrase used for centuries in Roman officialdom. Even when their understanding of Latin grammar faltered, the forms endured. It was not uncommon for scribes in post-Roman Gaul or Anglo-Saxon Britain to copy word for word standard Roman phrases, sometimes without understanding their full meaning. It was bureaucracy as liturgy, a ritual preserved because it was sacred, not because it was entirely understood. In some cases, the handwriting itself told the story. Roman cursive styles evolved into the half-uncial and minuscule scripts favored in monasteries. Even the layout of documents' margins, spacing, introductory invocations, retained echoes of imperial formatting. To read a land grant from 720 CE in a Frankish monastery is, in many ways, to read a fossilized Roman legal document. The empire had not survived, but its penmanship had, and that penmanship shaped more than just paperwork. It structured thought. The Roman habit of categorizing, listing, codifying, all deeply embedded in its bureaucracy, influenced how early medieval people organized knowledge. Monastic chronicles, for example, often followed the same sequential and administrative logic of Roman tax rolls, by year, by event, by cause. This influence was not limited to Christian Europe. In the Islamic world, particularly in the Umayyad and early Abbasid caliphates, many administrative practices were modeled on those of the late Roman and Byzantine empires. Early Islamic Diwan systems, bureaucratic offices, often employed former Roman or Persian administrators. The process of recording tax, land, and military information followed procedures not dissimilar from those developed under Diocletian or Theodosius. Indeed, the very idea of the state archive, a centralized collection of important records, is a Roman legacy. Cities like Constantinople, which carried the Roman administrative model into the Byzantine period, maintained vast repositories of decrees, financial statements, and census data. These records were not merely legal tools. They were ideological instruments, proof that the state remembered, that it counted, that it knew. Yet even as the form persisted, the empire faded into abstraction. By the 8th or 9th century, many who copied Roman phrases no longer considered themselves Roman in any real political or cultural sense. The word Roman had become flexible. In Byzantium, it still meant imperial citizenship. In the West, it became a mark of tradition, of legitimacy, of learnedness, but not of governance. A bishop signing a charter in Carolingian Francia might refer to Roman law without ever having read a Roman legal code. A local lord might seal a land deal with a document modeled on a centuries-old Roman form, unaware of the bureaucrats who first created it in Ravenna or Mediolanum. What survived was the silhouette of empire, a shape without a center. There is something profoundly human in this. The instinct to preserve form, even when the content is forgotten, speaks to our desire for continuity. For the scribes of the early medieval world, copying a Roman document was a way of connecting with something older, greater, and more ordered than the fragile, uncertain world they inhabited. And there's a certain irony in that. The men who once watched the empire decay through their offices, who adjusted tax rolls and marked down missing shipments, could never have known that their habits would outlive the state they served, that the margins of their ledgers would become the blueprint for kingdoms yet unborn. Even today, in the terminology of modern governments, in census-taking, notarized documents, formal letters of appointment, traces of Roman bureaucracy linger. The idea that a government's legitimacy lies, at least in part, in its paperwork, is one of Rome's most persistent gifts to the world. And so, the forgotten clerks, Quintus Aelius Fortunatus, the nameless copyist in Arles, the overworked scribe in Gaul, live on, not as statues or stories, but in the architecture of administration. They left no monuments, but they left margins. And in those margins, written carefully in ink, is the last voice of a dying empire, not shouting, not even whispering, just continuing, as if the empire still stood. In the vast stretches of land, along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, thousands of Roman soldiers once stood guard. They lived in orderly forts of stone and timber, marched according to posted rotations, received scheduled supplies, and expected a regular stipend. For generations, this system had formed the outer shell of Roman security. It didn't just defend the empire, it defined its edge. The limes, as the frontier was called, was where Roman order ended and the uncertainty beyond began. But by the late 4th and early 5th centuries, that order was eroding. not from overwhelming enemy assault, but from something quieter, missing payments. The Roman military machine was not simply a force of arms. It was a logistical system built on paperwork, coin, and delivery. Soldiers were not paid in vague promises. They expected coin stipends, food allotments, land grants, upon retirement, and steady supplies of tools, leather, salt, oil, and grain. The promise of compensation was one of Rome's most enduring bonds with its soldiers, and one of its most fragile. In the early empire, soldiers had been paid directly from the imperial treasury. Coins were minted in Rome or later at regional mints in Trier, Arles, or Mediolanum. Pay officers travelled with strongboxes and accounts, ensuring that troops were compensated. A legionary knew that after a month of standing watch, patrolling, or guarding caravans, he would receive a specific amount in denarii or solidi and a corresponding issue of supplies. But as the empire aged, this promise began to crack. Inflation, in the 3rd century, had already weakened the value of coin. By the 4th century, under Diocletian and Constantine, reforms tried to stabilize the currency and restructure military payment. Yet these efforts, while temporarily effective, could not account for deeper fractures. The empire's income, from taxes, tribute, and trade, no longer reliably matched its expenses. The military, consuming more than half the state's budget, felt this gap early and sharply. One of the first warning signs was inconsistency. Soldiers would still receive pay, but it might arrive late, in partial installments, or through substitutions. Grain instead of coin, olive oil instead of wine, cloth instead of salt. A centurion in Raetia might spend weeks calculating how to divide a shipment of moldy barley among his troops while waiting on silver that never came. The administrative records show a growing reliance on such substitutions. A surviving papyrus from Egypt, dated to 401 CE, lists a military pay register where more than half the soldiers were compensated with goods instead of money. One note reads, "Issued in kind due to lack of coinage." These kinds of annotations become increasingly common in the late empire. Along the northern frontiers, where distance from the imperial center made delivery slower and less predictable, the effects were sharper. Garrison commanders sent repeated requests for back pay. Some attempted to barter with local landowners to feed their troops. Others began quietly allowing soldiers to settle nearby, giving them plots of land in exchange for continued service, an unofficial process that became increasingly institutionalized. In some forts, discipline began to erode. Soldiers who once lived in tight formations within barracks began dispersing to nearby villages or farms. They returned when summoned, drilled occasionally, but their loyalties grew local. Their armor grew worn. Their boots, once standard issue, were replaced by regional styles. They looked less Roman each year. The frontier forts themselves tell part of the story. Archaeological digs along the Danube have revealed layers of abandonment. Not dramatic destruction, just quiet departure. Barracks converted into barns, watchtowers repurposed as homes, latrines left unused, slowly filled with wind-blown dust. In one site near modern-day Bavaria, excavators uncovered a pay clerk's office that had been left intact, ink pots still in place, bronze scales for weighing coin rusted but whole. The last recorded entries in the ledger were crossed out with a simple line. No invasion, no fire, just an ending. The soldiers, too, began to change. With regular Roman pay failing, many turned to local patrons or power brokers for support. In border regions, this sometimes meant cooperating with tribal groups beyond the frontier, Germans, Huns, Alans, either by trade or in exchange for protection. A Roman outpost might quietly make arrangements with a local chieftain, safe passage in return for supplies. These were not acts of betrayal, they were acts of survival. The central government, overwhelmed and often understaffed, struggled to manage these local improvisations. Edicts were issued from Ravenna or Milan insisting on proper military conduct, but the means to enforce them were fading. A general might receive orders to restore discipline in Pannonia, only to discover that half the garrison had left and the rest had integrated into local farming communities. In other cases, military units became local war bands, with no steady income. Some groups began extracting wealth from nearby towns, officially as tax collectors, unofficially as raiders. The line between Roman soldier and mercenary blurred. Some commanders turned their troops into private militias, offering protection to provincial governors in exchange for land or political support. The shift from salaried soldier to landbound warrior was gradual but profound. Soldiers began marrying local women, settling permanently, raising families, and passing down their status. A new class emerged, not quite Roman, not quite foreign, bound more by location than by allegiance. These men still called themselves soldiers. They still wore the remnants of Roman armor, but their pay came from the soil, not the treasury. Imperial response was uneven. In some regions, land grants were formalized. The system of federati, tribal groups settled in Roman territory in exchange for military service, expanded. In theory, it provided defense at lower cost. In practice, it decentralized control. The state became less an employer and more a negotiator, brokering deals with military leaders who increasingly acted as independent lords. This arrangement could work for a while, but it changed the very nature of Roman power. Where once soldiers owed loyalty to the emperor and were paid from a central fund, now their loyalties lay with those who fed them, clothed them, and provided safety for their families. And so the forts emptied, not in battle, but through decay. The walls still stood, but the barracks were quiet. The parade grounds, once beaten flat by generations of marching feet, became overgrown, and the watchfires along the borders flickered out, not doused by conquest, but by disinterest. What happens to an empire when its guardians are no longer paid? That question lingered in the silence of abandoned garrisons, and in the shifting loyalties of the men who once stood watch beneath Roman banners. When the coins stopped flowing and the army's ledgers went blank, many Roman soldiers simply walked away from their posts. But not all of them disappeared into the hills or abandoned their armor. Some stayed, and in staying, they became something new. Not state employees, but settlers, local defenders, even political brokers. Their transformation reshaped entire regions of the former Western Empire, not through conquest or defection, but through persistence. Across the old imperial frontiers, especially in Gaul, northern Italy, and parts of the Balkans, Roman soldiers gradually ceased to function as part of a unified force. Instead, they became men of place, rooted, bound not to emperors in Ravenna or Constantinople, but to fields, families, and whoever could provide bread and security. In northern Gaul, along what had once been the heavily militarized Rhine frontier, archaeological evidence tells a quiet but consistent story. Forts that had once housed hundreds of troops became small hamlets. Barracks were subdivided into homes. Stables were turned into workshops. Defensive walls were maintained, not by imperial engineers, but by communities of former soldiers and their descendants. One such site, excavated near modern-day Cologne, shows the remains of a Roman principia, the central building of a fort, that had been converted into a multi-room residence by the early 6th century. Embedded in the plaster were fragments of uniform fittings and broken military gear, repurposed into tools. This was no longer a place of drills and discipline. It was a home, built by men who had stopped waiting for orders. The same pattern held in many other places. With no regular stipend, many soldiers took land, either formally through imperial grants or informally by simply settling where they had been stationed. In some cases, this process was encouraged by local governors who lacked resources to feed their garrisons, but were desperate to retain any semblance of protection. This led to the rise of what later chroniclers would call the milites rustici, rural soldiers. They farmed, they guarded roads, they kept peace in nearby villages. They swore loyalty not to Rome, but to local authorities or bishops. Their Latin was coarse, their armor mismatched, but they considered themselves Romans in spirit, if not in structure. Meanwhile, the imperial court in Ravenna continued to issue orders, commissions, and payment schedules. But these increasingly failed to match reality. A command to send a unit from Pannonia to reinforce Italy might take months to arrive, only to find that the unit no longer existed. The officer had retired, the men had married locals, and the watchtower had been turned into a granary. In such a landscape, military titles persisted but changed meaning. A dux, once a field commander, might now be a landowning noble with a few dozen armed retainers. A comes, originally a senior officer, could become little more than a prominent village chief. These men retained their Roman rank, wore Roman insignia when possible, and issued orders in Latin. But their power came not from the state, but from their ability to feed people and keep roads safe. In Gaul, this transformation was particularly pronounced. The collapse of Roman authority allowed for the rise of hybrid powers, part Roman, part Germanic, often rooted in military communities. The Visigoths, settled as federati in Aquitaine, maintained their own structures, but relied heavily on Roman-trained soldiers and administrators. Some of these soldiers were former legionaries who had accepted new overlords simply to survive. Letters from Sidonius Apollinaris, a Gallo-Roman aristocrat writing in the mid-400s, describe encounters with men who still bore Roman titles, but operated as independent powers. In one letter, he writes of a commander who maintained a road patrol and issued travel documents. Even though his allegiance was uncertain, he calls himself come still, though his orders come from no emperor I recognize. These men blurred the line between public and private force. They weren't mercenaries, at least not in the traditional sense. They were local defenders, rooted in land and family, using whatever authority remained to maintain order. And they were tolerated, even respected, because they filled a vacuum no one else could. In Italy, a similar process unfolded. As imperial forces shrank, particularly in the north, bishops and landowners began organizing local defenses. Some hired former soldiers, others relied on rural militias composed of ex-legionaries. These groups weren't polished or well-equipped, but they knew the terrain, and they had a deep sense of communal responsibility. Defense was no longer a state matter. It was a neighborhood one. In some towns, defense became ritualized. Bells would ring not just for prayer, but for patrol changes. Local calendars included watches and grain levies for communal stockpiles. Former soldiers trained young men in swordsmanship and drilling, not to serve Rome, but to protect their fields from raids. In this way, the Roman military tradition was preserved in miniature, fragmented, localized, but alive. What's notable is how much Roman identity remained in these pockets. Even as the empire disappeared, the idea of Romanitas, of being Roman, clung to these former soldiers and their communities. They kept Roman names. They used Roman weights and measures. They invoked Roman law in disputes, even if no court recognized their rulings. To them, Rome was not a place or a ruler. It was a habit of living. In Hispania, former garrison towns often became self-governing enclaves. A council of elders, many of them retired officers, would oversee trade, settle disputes, and coordinate with neighboring settlements. Their authority was not derived from charters or imperial decrees, but from memory. This is how things had been done, and so this is how they should be done still. Sometimes this worked well. Peace was kept, roads were repaired, trade continued. Other times it led to conflict. Rival militias clashed. Ambitious leaders declared themselves protectors or kings. The absence of a central power meant the return of old human struggles, ambition, rivalry, fear. And yet, even in this uncertainty, the old military foundations offered stability. What emerges from this period is not a story of collapse so much as a story of transformation. The Roman soldier, once a uniformed agent of the state, became a village defender, a farmer with a spear, a local leader who remembered how things used to be. In staying, even without pay, These men preserved fragments of an empire in their watchfulness, their discipline, and their language. And so the forts, though empty of coin and command, remained inhabited by memory, and by men who had once guarded an empire and now guarded only themselves. The Western Roman Empire officially ended in 476 CE, but in many ways its soldiers never fully vanished. Their paymasters might have disappeared, their legions might have dissolved, their armor might have dulled to rust, but their habits, formations, and memory endured. Like old echoes, the routines of Roman military life drifted into the early medieval world, incomplete sometimes, misunderstood but still powerful. Many of the men who had once served the Roman state, or grown up in its military towns, became the foundation for new armies. The Visigothic, Burgundian, and Frankish kingdoms that rose from Rome's crumbling territories were not built from scratch. They were assembled atop the remains of old garrisons, trained by men who still drilled like legionaries and organized their ranks like centuries of Roman manuals had taught. In Gaul, for example, the early Merovingian armies relied heavily on local power centers that had once been Roman military outposts. A comes in late Roman terms became a count in Frankish usage. Though the political structure was shifting rapidly, the military vocabulary often remained Latin. The term milites, meaning soldiers, survived and adapted to describe both armed retainers and local warriors. Many of these milites were sons or grandsons of men who had once stood sentry under Roman command. The influence ran deeper than language. Roman training emphasized unit discipline, tight formations, logistical support, and engineering, practices that deeply influenced post-Roman military organization. In the 6th century, Frankish kings such as Clovis and his sons inherited not just Roman roads and towns, but Roman military customs. Some early chroniclers note how certain units of Frankish troops marched in Roman style, forming shield, lines, obeying trumpet signals, and maintaining camp structures based on Roman models. And while the professional army had largely disappeared, the idea of military service as a structured, rewarded responsibility lingered. Some post-Roman rulers issued land grants in exchange for defense, a practice not unlike the Roman beneficium, where soldiers received land or revenue as part of their service. Over time, this would evolve into the medieval system of feudal obligation, but its roots lay in the agreements made by Roman commanders with underpaid or landless troops during the empire's final years. The Roman military was also deeply tied to the concept of rank: centurions, decurions, tribunes. Though these titles faded in use, their principles survived. Early medieval warbands often retained hierarchies based on experience, command loyalty, and symbolic badges. In some parts of Gaul and Italy, bronze military brooches once worn by officers continued to be used as marks of honor, passed down like heirlooms. Even in the Eastern Empire, which survived the Western collapse and thrived in Constantinople, the influence of Western military collapse was felt. Eastern emperors, especially Justinian in the 6th century, sought to recover lost Western territories. When his general Belisarius invaded North Africa and Italy, he encountered populations who still remembered Roman rule, and in some places, Roman-style militias who welcomed the imperial eagle's return. These moments of reconnection underscore how Rome's military didn't vanish. It fragmented, localized, and adapted. Forts once ruled by central authority were now defended by town militias. Roads once patrolled by Roman cavalry now hosted village guards. Armies still formed, but they looked backward to Rome, even if they no longer understood everything they imitated. In Italy, the situation was more layered. Under Theodoric the Ostrogoth, the remnants of Roman military practice were actively preserved. Theodoric kept a Romanized administration and employed many former imperial officers. His government issued military orders in Latin, preserved training, manuals, and maintained defensive works in urban centers. One of his top officials, Cassiodorus, famously emphasized the need to honor Roman tradition, not for sentiment, but for functionality, and it worked. For a time, Roman military infrastructure meshed with Gothic leadership. Officers received grain allotments, some border forces were rebuilt, and Roman engineering techniques were applied to urban defense. Though Theodoric ruled as a king, his realm looked, on paper, very much like an extension of the old Western Empire. And the soldiers under his command, many of whom were born in Italy to Roman families, carried themselves as if the empire had never truly ended. Even further west, in regions like Hispania and Britannia, Roman military DNA endured in surprising ways. In Hispania, the Visigothic kings maintained some version of the limitani, the old frontier soldiers, well into the 7th century. Their records, though sparse, mention troops stationed at mountain passes and river crossings, fulfilling roles nearly identical to those assigned in Roman times. In post-Roman Britain, the picture is murkier, but archaeological remains point to a prolonged Roman military presence after official withdrawal. Some forts continued to be occupied. Roman weapon styles were imitated, and local rulers, possibly descendants of Roman officers, defended towns with a blend of native and Roman tactics. The legendary figure of King Arthur, though wrapped in myth, may be rooted in one such local warlord, a Romano-British leader who fought Saxon incursions with Roman strategy long after Rome's departure. In all these cases, the question is not whether Roman soldiers survived, but what they became. They were no longer legionaries. They did not march under the SPQR, but they carried forward the memory of drill, the instinct for formation, the knowledge of logistics, and the belief that peace required preparedness. And perhaps most importantly, they preserved the idea that soldiers were not simply fighters, but public servants. Rome had long emphasized that soldiers built roads, guarded markets, and maintained order, a civil as well as military role. In the early medieval period, many former Roman troops filled exactly these needs, guarding trade routes, escorting officials, and settling disputes. They were not just remnants. They were bridges. What is remarkable is how thoroughly this influence was absorbed into the societies that followed Rome. The early medieval knight, the town watchman, the marcher lord, all owe something to the forgotten soldiers of Rome's last garrisons. Even if they no longer saluted the eagle, they bore the habits of those who once did. And so, in the fields beyond the old limes, in villages carved from stone watchtowers, in training routines whispered father to son, the Roman soldier lived on, not as a conqueror, but as a memory, a habit, a shape left behind by centuries of ordered movement. The decline of Rome is often imagined as fire and ruin, invaders smashing aqueducts, temples burning, cities collapsing in chaos. But in most places, the end came more quietly. A bathhouse that stopped heating its floors, a road that slowly filled with weeds, a leaking pipe that no one bothered to fix. Rome's grand infrastructure didn't fall. It faded. At the heart of this slow disintegration was one of Rome's greatest triumphs, its urban engineering. Roman cities, especially the larger ones like Rome, Carthage, and Trier, were marvels of human planning. They featured paved roads, running water, sewers, heated baths, amphitheaters, and forums, all built with precision and care. These features weren't luxuries, they were expectations. The physical structure of the empire made daily life more efficient, more comfortable, more predictable. For centuries, the system worked. Rome maintained more than 400,000 kilometers of roads across its empire. Dozens of aqueducts fed cities and farms. Sewers like Rome's Cloaca Maxima carried waste out of urban centers. Public fountains ran day and night, fed by a network of carefully graded conduits. Maintenance crews employed by local and central administrations kept everything functioning. Imperial funds, drawn from taxes and tribute, paid the salaries of inspectors, stonecutters, plumbers, and sweepers. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, these systems were already under pressure. As the empire's revenues declined, fewer resources were available for routine repairs. The first signs weren't dramatic. A chipped stone here, a cracked drain there. Fountains that once shot water high into the air began to sputter. City governors, strapped for cash, delayed maintenance and diverted funds to more immediate concerns. grain shortages, military stipends, border defenses. One key example is Rome's own aqueduct system. At its peak, the city was served by 11 major aqueducts, carrying an estimated 1 million cubic meters of water per day. This supplied not just the elite, but countless public amenities: baths, fountains, latrines, and gardens. Maintaining this system required constant attention. Lime deposits had to be scraped from channels, supports had to be reinforced, leaks had to be patched. Water inspectors, curatores aquarum, had significant authority and staff. But by the early 400s, aqueduct maintenance was inconsistent. Letters from the city's administrators began noting service interruptions. In one record, a senator complains that the Aqua Traiana, once a steady source, now flowed only intermittently. Theft became common. Farmers and landowners tapped the aqueducts to irrigate fields or fill private cisterns, reducing pressure in the system. Without strong enforcement, these diversions became permanent. The pipes themselves, often made of lead or terracotta, began to wear out. Replacing them required skilled labor and costly materials. And skilled labor was growing scarce. The workshops that once trained generations of craftsmen were declining. Apprenticeship systems broke down. As infrastructure knowledge concentrated in fewer hands, cities struggled to maintain what had been routine. In smaller cities, the decay was faster. The grand baths of a provincial capital might continue operating in a limited capacity, but without heated floors or running water. Cold water basins replaced the warm caldarium. Drainage systems clogged. With less public funding, many towns began abandoning their largest public spaces. Amphitheaters fell silent. Forums were overtaken by makeshift markets. Columns cracked from weather and neglect. In one town in southern Gaul, archaeologists discovered a set of paving stones that had been lifted and reused as building materials for a private home, likely in the early 5th century. The road they once formed had become irrelevant. No caravans came. No imperial officials arrived. So the stone was better used elsewhere. The loss of infrastructure was not just physical. It changed behavior. In Rome itself, the Forum, once the bustling heart of civic life, began to empty. Without routine cleaning and maintenance, dirt accumulated. Shrubs and trees sprouted between flagstones. Animals roamed freely. People adjusted. Meetings were held in smaller churches or courtyards. Water was fetched from wells instead of fountains. The decay was not mourned, it was adapted to. Some elites continued to maintain their private amenities. Wealthy families diverted water into personal cisterns. Private bathhouses, more modest than their public predecessors, remained active in some quarters of cities. But the communal element, the shared infrastructure that had defined Roman urban identity, began to vanish. One symbol of this change was the fading of street lighting. In major Roman cities, torchbearers and oil lamps once lit thoroughfares at night. With reduced funding, this public lighting disappeared. Streets became dangerous after sunset. Merchants closed early. Travelers moved in groups. Nighttime, once navigable, became shadowed and silent. Another subtle shift came in sanitation. Rome's famed sewer systems were never glamorous, but they were effective. Waste flowed out, rather than sitting in alleys or ditches. As maintenance faltered, clogs increased. Latrines fell into disuse. In many towns, open dumping returned. Disease followed. Local healers, often affiliated with Christian communities, noted rising fevers and infections in densely packed quarters. Conditions that had been mitigated, if not eliminated, by Roman sanitation. Despite all this, the cities did not vanish. People adapted. Buildings were repurposed. A collapsed aqueduct arch became a stable. A defunct bathhouse became a church. The massive domes of imperial architecture were sometimes preserved, simply because they made good roofs. Communities began growing vegetables in old courtyards. The grandeur faded, but life continued. Importantly, none of this was the result of deliberate destruction. The aqueducts weren't torn down, the roads weren't ripped apart, they were simply left unattended. Time, weather, plant roots, and 1,000 small cracks did the work that no army ever managed. And yet, the memory remained. Generations after the last aqueduct dried up, medieval chroniclers still marveled at the ruins. In the 6th century, the Gothic historian Jordanes wrote of the great works of Rome, now broken by age. He saw them not as failures, but as monuments. Even in ruin, the infrastructure of Rome inspired awe. The question lingers, like the dripping echo in a dry aqueduct tunnel. What happens to a civilization when the buildings outlast the will to repair them? The Roman world had once been knitted together by more than conquest and coin. It was a landscape of stone and road, water and heat, a place where everyday life relied on the built environment. But as the empire weakened, that daily experience shifted, not in a moment, not through fire or siege, but through a slow and steady erosion of access. It began with distance. A city like Rome could feel the crumbling long before a remote village. Urban populations, accustomed to convenience, found themselves walking farther for water, waiting longer for carts, and watching familiar services become erratic. In the countryside, change came more slowly, but when it arrived, it was harder to reverse. The cursus publicus, Rome's state-run courier and transportation network, was one of the first systems to shrink. Designed under Augustus and refined, over centuries it allowed messengers and supplies to move across the empire at remarkable speed. Relay stations, known as mutationes, offered fresh horses, and rest stations, or mansiones, provided shelter, food, and security. Imperial roads were marked with milestones, and travel permits were issued by administrators with seals of authority. But by the late 4th century, this system had begun to collapse. Funding cuts meant that fewer horses were maintained at stations. Repairs on roads were postponed or ignored. In some cases, local governors commandeered the relay animals for their own purposes, or the relay posts were seized by bandits and abandoned altogether. An account from 410 CE describes an imperial messenger dispatched from Ravenna to Mediolanum, modern Milan, who took more than 3 weeks for a journey that, at its height, would have taken 5 days. His horse died, no replacement was available. He walked. He slept in empty stations and was robbed outside a village. His message, a routine bureaucratic directive, arrived weeks late, and by then, irrelevant. The loss of reliable travel meant not just slower communication, but more isolation. A trader from Carthage might once have brought olive oil to northern Italy along smooth, well-guarded roads. Now, he hired armed escorts and travelled in convoys, if he travelled at all. The expense discouraged movement, markets contracted, regional self-sufficiency replaced wide networks. Trade still happened, but with more risk and less regularity. In ciudades, towns, public spaces shrank. As aqueducts dried up and roads wore down, entire sections of cities were abandoned or repurposed. The outer edges of urban settlements, once vibrant with shops and taverns, grew quiet. People moved inward, clustering around still functioning wells, churches, or marketplaces. The footprint of the city physically shrank, even if its walls remained. Bathhouses, one of the most iconic features of Roman urban life, were especially affected. They required large, complex infrastructure, heated floors, hypocaust systems, constant water flow, dedicated maintenance teams, and dependable fuel supplies. As wood became more expensive and aqueducts unreliable, even the largest baths began to close sections. Cold water only became common. Floors cracked, walls peeled. In the city of Arles, for instance, bathhouses operated into the early 5th century, but records suggest declining attendance. A bishop there wrote of young men who bathe no more, but sweat in cloaks and drink cold water, perhaps exaggerating, but capturing a cultural shift. The bath, once a symbol of leisure and hygiene, became a relic, eventually replaced by religious rituals of purification, or simply by washing at home. The decline of maintenance also changed the way people navigated cities. Weeds sprouted between paving stones. Drainage ditches clogged, creating puddles that became breeding grounds for disease. With fewer civic cleaners, the streets grew dirtier. Animals, pigs, goats, chickens, roamed more freely, scavenging, refuse. These weren't scenes of catastrophe, but of gradual lowering standards. People still lived, worked, traded, but less was expected. Even buildings once tied to authority were repurposed. Courthouses became storage facilities. Senate halls were converted into churches, or later into private homes. In Trier, the imperial palace was eventually used as a granary before being transformed into a cathedral. The meaning of stone shifted, no longer a symbol of imperial power, but of convenience. People used what they had. Rural communities adapted too. Where once they had relied on imperial engineers to inspect bridges or resurface roads, now they formed their own local systems. Wooden bridges replaced stone ones. Trails followed older roads but with shortcuts or diversions. Local knowledge became essential. Travelers asked shepherds for the best paths, rather than trusting maps or milestones. Post-Roman infrastructure was less about uniformity and more about improvisation. A fountain might be replaced by a well, a paved road by a dirt track, a bathhouse by a riverbank. People didn't mourn these changes, they adapted to them. But the consequences rippled through society. For example, illness increased. Without clean water and sanitation, waterborne diseases became more common. Monastic infirmaries recorded recurring outbreaks of fever and dysentery, especially in urban centers with clogged sewers and abandoned drainage. Doctors, often monks or lay healers, prescribed boiled water and herbal poultices, acknowledging that old methods were no longer available. Likewise, mobility declined. Without safe and consistent roads, people traveled less. Pilgrimages continued. People still walked to shrines and holy sites, but long-distance movement slowed. The empire, once a patchwork of interlinked communities, became a series of isolated islands. Regional dialects deepened, cultural fragmentation accelerated. Yet amid all this, people continued to build, just differently. Instead of massive aqueducts or forums, they built stone churches, timber halls, and simple bridges. These structures reflected new priorities: worship, local governance, subsistence. They required fewer materials, less labor, and were easier to repair. A church built in 520 CE in central Gaul used columns taken from a Roman temple. Its roof beams came from a collapsed bathhouse. Its foundation stones were marked with imperial symbols, now reoriented to support an altar. This was not desecration. It was transformation. The past was reused, not revered. And with each generation, knowledge faded. Fewer people understood how to calculate an aqueduct's gradient or construct a vault. The manuals existed, but fewer could read them. The skills passed down not by written instruction, but by touch, a craftsman showing his apprentice, and as those apprentices dwindled, so did the craft. By the late 6th century, the Western world was full of buildings whose purpose was no longer known. Arches that no longer led anywhere. Roads that connected towns no one visited. Fountains that gurgled only in spring. The infrastructure remained, but as mystery, not utility. The empire had been built on stone, but stone is heavy. Without the will to move, maintain, or shape it, it simply stayed where it was, worn, repurposed, and silent. And so the question lingered in every cracked wall and overgrown street. If no one walks the road anymore, is it still a road at all? By the 7th century, the landscape of the former Western Roman Empire had changed beyond recognition. The marble gleam had dulled. The aqueducts were cracked, the roads uneven, the forums quiet. Yet, though broken and largely forgotten, Roman infrastructure continued to shape the world beneath it, not in its original form, but in influence. in habits, boundaries, and decisions made without remembering their origin. In cities like Rome, Arles, and Milan, people no longer understood exactly how the aqueducts had worked, but they still built near their remnants. A broken channel might become a wall. A collapsed bridge might dictate the crossing of a new footpath. The physical bones of the Roman Empire defined where people could go, where they could settle, and what they could reach, even when the original blueprints were long lost. In the hills of southern Italy, for example, entire villages were built alongside old Roman roads. These roads were no longer maintained or officially mapped, but the stones beneath the grass still guided feet and carts. Travelers followed them, not out of loyalty to Rome, but because they remained the driest and most direct routes through the land. This accidental preservation meant that the Roman world never fully disappeared. Even without engineers or administrators, the infrastructure left behind continued to serve. Churches were built atop basilicas. Fortified houses repurposed old granaries. In some cases, wells dug in the Roman era were still in use, their linings worn smooth by centuries of drawn buckets. People learned to live alongside the ruins. In Ravenna, homes sprouted in what had once been grand imperial courtyards. In Trier, market stalls gathered in the shadow of half-standing walls. The brokenness wasn't seen as tragic, it was useful. Roman buildings were solid, their stones well cut. Why quarry new ones when the old city offered so many? In fact, many early medieval builders became stone scavengers, known as spoliators. They didn't destroy monuments maliciously, they disassembled them for parts. Columns were pulled from abandoned temples to support monastery cloisters. Roof tiles from bathhouses were reused in local chapels, and the act of reuse preserved some fragments better than time ever could. Because of this, Roman craftsmanship echoed in strange places. A 6th century peasant might kneel to pray beneath a vaulted roof originally made for a Roman magistrate. A monk might copy sacred texts on a desk built from a Roman legal archive. A child might play with tiles that once covered a senator's floor. None of them knew the full story, but the materials carried it forward. There's evidence, too, that the memory of maintenance lingered. Some early medieval communities kept local watchmen or assigned repair duties to certain households. A 580 CE record from a Gallic monastery details rules for rotating street cleaning duties in the surrounding town, a faint echo of the old Roman curatores, the overseers of urban upkeep. In rural areas, the influence was subtler but still strong. Roman roads determined settlement patterns for centuries. Villages formed near crossroads. Farms followed Roman land divisions, even if no one remembered the centuriation system that once measured every field with precision. Property lines in parts of Spain, southern France, and Italy still trace Roman surveying patterns today. The legacy also persisted in language. The Latin word strata, paved road, survives in Italian as strada, in Spanish as estrada, and in French as estrée. These linguistic fossils mark where roads once ran. Towns with names like Chester, from Latin castra, meaning camp, or Strasbourg, from strata burgus, road town, reveal the quiet persistence of Roman infrastructure in identity and place naming. And yet, by this time, few people truly understood how the great works had been made. The technical knowledge had thinned. Treatises survived. Vitruvius's De Architectura, Frontinus's writings on aqueducts. But these texts were kept in monasteries, read by few, and copied slowly. The practical traditions, passed once from master to apprentice in imperial guilds, were fading. Still, curiosity remained. In the 8th century, a monk near Lyon wrote of visiting an old Roman bath and marveled at the hollow floors and vaulted ceilings. He called it a house of warm wind and wondered aloud if spirits had built it. The technological wonder of heated air seemed magical. The method was no longer understood, but the structure still impressed. This awe coexisted with misunderstanding. Medieval drawings of aqueducts and baths often misrepresented their function. Some believed that aqueducts had carried wine, Others thought the Romans had tamed underground dragons to bring water to cities. The truth had grown hazy, replaced by legend, misinterpretation, or myth. But the infrastructure still mattered because people still used it. There were moments, too, of revival. Charlemagne, in the late 700s, ordered the repair of certain Roman roads and bridges. He saw value in their strength and understood, in his own way, that the empire he was building stood atop the skeleton of another. His officials studied old Roman records. His builders examined Roman stonework. They couldn't replicate it perfectly, but they imitated what they could. Throughout the early Middle Ages, Rome's infrastructure served as a foundation, not just physically, but culturally. Its remnants grounded people in place. Its ruins offered shelter. Its stones offered materials, and its paths offered direction. Even when forgotten, it continued to give shape to the lives built over it. And perhaps that is Rome's quietest victory, not in marble columns or golden eagles, but in rutted stones walked by bare feet, in aqueduct arches, standing under new roofs, in the decision to build a town square where a Roman forum once stood. Not because history demanded it, but because the land remembered. So many empires end in conquest. But this one lingered in limestone. And beneath every root that cracked a Roman wall, a question endured. When the builders are forgotten, but their work still holds, is the empire truly gone? In the early Roman Empire, commerce was a matter of record. Goods moved along paved roads, entered bustling ports, passed through official checkpoints, and were taxed, weighed, sealed, and noted. Traders held stamped documents, customs inspectors tracked quantities, and state officials enforced regulations with firm consistency. The economy ran on structure. Grain, wine, oil, and textiles flowed from province to province in predictable, documented patterns. But by the late 4th and early 5th centuries, something had begun to shift. Not suddenly, not through rebellion, but through silence. Some goods stopped being registered. Some ports grew quiet. Some checkpoints stood unmanned. A trader would arrive with cargo and find no one there to take the tax. At first, these lapses felt like freedom. Fewer tolls, no waiting in line. A chance to sell directly at better margins. But as the imperial trade network thinned, so did its protections. Roads were less safe, ports less guarded, records less trusted. What emerged in its place was quieter and less visible. The whisper market. Smuggling had always existed in the Roman world, just as in any large economic system. But under the late empire, it changed character. It became not an exception, but a necessity. In North Africa, once a hub of grain and olive oil exports, port traffic began to decline. Traders who once carried stamped manifests to Carthage or Leptis Magna started operating differently. They sailed smaller ships, avoided major harbors, used hidden coves along the coastline where they met buyers directly. Goods were exchanged, by night or in isolated villages. No paperwork, no officials, just barter or coin. Why? Partly because the state could no longer guarantee safe passage or fair rates. In many regions, toll collectors began charging inflated fees, not to Rome, but to line their own pockets. Arbitrary fines and bribes became common. The more a merchant relied on official channels, the more they paid, and the less they received. One letter from a trader in Gaul, dated around 403 CE, describes how a shipment of pottery meant for Narbo was confiscated by a regional tax agent. He took 5 crates as duty, the trader wrote, then 2 more as kindness. I will not pass that road again. Instead, he chose a river route through less monitored villages. His sales were fewer, but they were his. In the Alpine regions between Italy and Gaul, narrow passes became smugglers' corridors. Salt, a high-value and heavily taxed commodity, was among the most commonly hidden goods. Caravans packed salt into sacks beneath hay or grain, disguised wagons, and employed children to act as lookouts. Some routes were patrolled not by Roman soldiers, but by local strongmen who took payment in kind. And yet, the people trading along these paths didn't see themselves as criminals. They were bakers, potters, and shepherds, not rebels. They simply couldn't afford to operate within an economic system that no longer functioned fairly. The whisper market wasn't a black market in the modern sense. It was a workaround, a whispered agreement between neighbors. In urban centers, especially shrinking cities like Mediolanum or Massilia, entire quarters began to operate in informal economies. Markets that once buzzed under the shadow of imperial tax collectors now held stalls without permits. Foreign spices arrived without explanation. Dyes were sold in back alleys. Wine from distant vineyards flowed into cups without ever being recorded in a ledger. Some officials tolerated this. Others quietly participated. A regional administrator might look the other way if a shipment arrived after hours so long as a jug of wine or a bag of coin found its way to his table. The line between law and necessity blurred, and over time, the practice became normalized. Even clergy began participating. In one case, preserved in the letters of Bishop Avitus of Vienne, a local church stored grain purchased from a merchant known to avoid toll roads. "The poor must be fed," the bishop wrote. "Let Caesar sue me." He wasn't being flippant. He simply no longer saw Rome's trade laws as morally binding. His priority was hunger, not paperwork. The Eastern Empire, still stronger at this time, attempted to intervene. Edicts were issued against illegal trade. Tax reforms were proposed. Inspectors were dispatched. But the West, fragmented and disordered, proved difficult to police. Traders simply rerouted. Goods were offloaded earlier. Coins changed hands in barns and backrooms. Rome could not seal every port, patrol every road, or inspect every cart. As this informal economy grew, a new type of trader emerged. Not the wealthy merchant with fleets and contracts, but the small-scale opportunist. A goat herder who brought cheese to a distant market in return for salt. A potter who swapped his wares for sacks of grain. These exchanges were direct, personal, and often completely undocumented. Trust replaced bureaucracy. Word of mouth replaced stamps. In this world, reputation was everything. A trader known to dilute oil or short the scale could find himself boycotted by a village. But one who offered fair exchanges, kept promises, and delivered consistently might gain a loyal clientele, even if his trade was technically illegal. Coins continued to circulate, but not always imperial. Regional and imitation currencies gained ground. In some places, Roman coins were cut in halves or quarters to make small change. Elsewhere, bartering replaced coin altogether. A sack of barley for a basket of eggs, a length of cloth for a piglet. These were simple human arrangements, and they worked. This doesn't mean the imperial economy vanished entirely. Larger cities and some coastal areas maintained official trade. Tariffs were still collected. Contracts were still signed. But the scale had shrunk. What once spanned continents now served regions. What once filled galleys now fit on mules. And perhaps most importantly, commerce stopped feeling Roman. It no longer required state approval. It no longer flowed from the center outward. It began instead at the edges, in fields, alleys, hills, and whispers. And as the empire's ledgers grew thinner, a quiet question grew louder in the mouths of those who traded by night. If a transaction feeds a family, does it matter whether it was ever recorded? By the mid-5th century, the economy of the Western Roman Empire was no longer a grand system guided by official decrees, but a patchwork of improvisation. The whisper market, local, informal, often invisible to the state, was no longer an alternative. It was becoming the new normal, and as it spread, it began to do something unexpected. It reorganized power. This new economy didn't need emperors or edicts. It didn't run on imperial gold or formal contracts. It operated on trust, familiarity, and proximity. Who you knew mattered more than what you could prove. And because the central state was too weak to enforce its will, the market flowed around it like water around a crumbling wall. In many regions, especially in the rural provinces of Gaul, Britannia, and North Africa, people no longer relied on Rome for trade security. Instead, they turned to local protectors, strongmen, landowners, or even bishops, who provided access to goods, storage space, and guarded trade routes. These figures, once minor or peripheral, grew essential. One Gallic farmer, for instance, might store his grain in a noble's barn during winter, with the understanding that a portion would be taken as protection. In return, he was connected to a regional grain market managed through informal networks, not by tax law, but by personal relationships. That nobleman may have once been a military officer or tax collector. Now, he was a broker, a gatekeeper between rural production and urban demand. These arrangements were not viewed as criminal. In the absence of state consistency, predictability itself became a form of justice. If a village elder ensured fair scales, enforced honest deals, and punished theft, he commanded more loyalty than a distant governor issuing hollow proclamations. The structure of trade was shifting, not vanishing, but devolving into something hyper-local. Markets became more discreet. Instead of public forums with marble stalls and shouted prices, exchanges happened in courtyards, at crossroads, near monasteries, or on the edges of forest trails. Sellers operated by routine rather than schedule. A buyer knew that the goat herder would arrive near the ruined bridge on every 7th day, carrying butter wrapped in waxed cloth. No bell rang, no tax was levied, but the transaction happened just the same. Interestingly, some monasteries played a dual role. While religious life demanded simplicity, monasteries also became centers of economic life. Monks grew food, made wine, and stored surpluses in large cellars. These stores, when traded or gifted to surrounding communities, created new flows of commerce. Sometimes, monks even facilitated trades between locals, hosting neutral ground for difficult negotiations. Their literacy, still rare, also allowed them to keep ledgers, not for taxes, but for stewardship. In this new economic world, old skills lost value while others rose. A scribe trained to copy legal contracts might now spend more time tallying jars of olive oil or recording barn inventories. A former tax inspector might serve as an advisor to a nobleman turned trade arbiter. People repurposed their knowledge, their tools, their authority. The disappearance of imperial enforcement also brought a strange kind of honesty. Without courts to appeal to, disputes had to be settled face to face. In one letter from a village near Acquay-Sextier, modern Aix-en-Provence, a dispute over a shipment of dried figs was resolved by a council of elders, who decided the matter based on witness testimony and reputation. No law codes, just trust. The shift also encouraged creativity in trade. Barter systems flourished. People traded services as well as goods, repairing tools in exchange for wool, offering woodcutting labor for honey. Coins still circulated, but often in small denominations and in fragmented condition. Byzantine coins from the East began to mix with older Roman coins and regional imitations. In some cases, clay tokens or marked sticks were used to represent value in places too remote for coinage. Some regions developed localized currencies, not official, but widely recognized. In parts of Hispania, stamped lead discs were exchanged among traders in place of silver coins. These discs bore simple marks indicating value and origin. They weren't legal tender, but they were accepted because they worked. And as the economy localized, so did loyalty. People no longer tied their survival to the empire, but to those who facilitated their access to goods. A village that once celebrated the emperor's birthday now held feast days in honor of the patron who protected their market, or the saint whose relics drew pilgrims, and with them, trade. In this context, trade fairs began to emerge. These were not organized by imperial decree, but by tradition or regional agreement. Held near rivers, shrines, or crossroads, They allowed dispersed communities to gather and exchange goods. One such fair, held near the old Roman city of Lugdunum, became a staple event by the late 400s, attracting traders from dozens of nearby villages. Songs were sung, bargains struck, no taxes collected, no documents filed. The whisper market was not without risks. Banditry increased along some routes. Without imperial patrols, merchants hired their own guards or travelled in groups. Some strong men became extortionists. A path that was safe one year might be dangerous the next. The trust-based economy depended on relationships, and relationships could fail. Yet people adapted. Systems of signalling emerged, simple carvings on trees, coloured cloths hung at meeting points to indicate safe paths or warn of ambushes. These informal signs, passed from traveller to traveller, replaced official milestones. The roads still existed, but they had been rewritten in code. Even knowledge became a traded good. A list of honest traders, a map of secret paths, a method for preserving cheese longer. These things held value. They were shared in exchange for favours, goods, or protection. The economy now included not just physical things, but survival information. And through it all, the empire remained a ghost, its taxes ignored, its ports bypassed, its merchants forgotten. People still used its roads, sometimes its coins, even its measuring tools. But they no longer traded in its name. They traded for themselves. And somewhere in a quiet valley, two farmers met by an old statue, no longer knowing whom it depicted, and made a deal over jars of honey and a broken sickle. No seal, no scribe, only need and trust. By the end of the 5th century, the whisper market had grown from a workaround into a way of life. It filled the space once held by the imperial economy, not as a formal replacement, but as something more flexible, more human, and more resilient. It didn't restore Rome's commercial greatness. It didn't need to. It allowed people to survive, and eventually, it laid the groundwork for something new. The legacy of this informal trade world would shape the early medieval economy in profound ways. Out of the cracks in the imperial structure, local markets began to formalize, not with imperial seals or census numbers, but with rhythm, custom, and familiarity. People returned to the same crossroads, the same village fairs, the same riverbanks. Sellers became known for their goods. Buyers learned who to trust. A shepherd who sold cheese each month might come to be called the cheeseman. A potter who travelled a 3-day loop through 4 villages would be expected on the 15th day. No calendar needed. No proclamation. He posted. These rhythms were so regular that when visitors entered a new village, they asked locals not about official merchants, but about who sells what and when. Over time, these small systems became interlinked. A basket weaver in Gaul might trade with a cloth dyer who knew someone near the Pyrenees who made salt. It was not a chain, but a web, strong in its irregularity. Each connection depended on memory, not record, and each node was personal. In this new commercial reality, the role of memory and oral reputation grew in importance. A merchant's word became his credential. A farmer's handshake became his guarantee. In the absence of state-backed contracts, communities relied on honor, shared stories, and long-term relationships. A man who broke a deal could be ostracized, not by law, but by being denied the ability to trade again. This economy also encouraged resourcefulness and experimentation. Without standardized supplies from centralized warehouses, craftsmen adapted to whatever was available. A smith might melt down old Roman nails to forge tools. A brewer might change his recipe depending on the season's grains. Local variety flourished. Regional styles of pottery, clothing, and food grew distinct. Identity was built into goods. Interestingly, many of the surviving market centers of medieval Europe were rooted not in Roman forums, but in former smuggling hubs. Places once known for their hidden stalls or semi-legal exchanges became legitimate. With no empire to oppose them, these markets grew naturally into centers of activity. A flat field by a river crossing might evolve into a bustling trade town. A forest path known for bandits might become a toll road, maintained not by Rome, but by the local abbey. Some of these locations became permanent settlements. Traders built homes. Families grew around seasonal fairs. Churches were erected to bless the deals. Over generations, these once quiet places earned names, boundaries, and a kind of legitimacy that no emperor ever granted, but that everyone accepted. Monasteries, too, expanded their role. Already producers of goods and keepers of records, they became hubs of exchange. A monastery that produced wine or vellum might offer it for trade with local shepherds, masons, or beekeepers. These exchanges were sometimes tracked in careful ledgers, the early precursors to later manorial accounts. In regions like Anglo-Saxon England and Merovingian Gaul, these local economic systems began to support larger political structures. Kings issued coinage, not as tools of taxation, but as symbols of trust in a growing market. Early medieval rulers didn't build roads or ports like Rome had, but they offered protection to existing markets and encouraged their use. A king who could guarantee safe passage to a fair was more valuable than one who issued laws no one enforced. And so the bones of the Roman economy, roads, coins, weights, were wrapped in new muscle. The empire had vanished, but its infrastructure remained, and layered onto it was a newer, more personal economy, built on face-to-face exchanges, local customs, and flexible arrangements. This kind of system was fragile in some ways. A bad harvest, a violent raid, or a dishonest trader could disrupt it quickly, but it was also resilient. Because it didn't rely on central control, it didn't collapse when the center failed, and it could be rebuilt over and over through trust. One traveling merchant's notebook from the late 6th century, partially preserved on wax tablets found in a former Roman villa in southern Gaul, records wool prices in 6 villages, notes about road safety, and names of local officials who were willing to assist with lodging and guard. The entries are brief, scattered, and practical, but they show a man moving with knowledge, not of the empire, but of the landscape left behind. Even the language evolved. Latin terms like negotiator, merchant, gave way to vernacular forms. Words like huckster, peddler, and tinker appeared. These were not grand traders. They were the lifeblood of the new economy, mobile, adaptive, and unlicensed. Over time, as towns stabilized and regional authorities grew, some whisper markets became formalized. Local lords might issue market charters. Church councils might approve fairs on saints' days. But these were not new creations. They were recognitions of existing practice. And so, as the Roman Empire faded into memory, its traders faded with it. But in their place stood something that endured, not because it was imposed, but because it was chosen. A world of deals made in the open air, of prices decided by need, of goods carried not by galleys, but by calloused hands, and at its center, a principle that neither empire nor ruin could erase. If two people can trade honestly, the world can go on. When the Western Roman Empire fell, many towns fell with it, cities shrank, legions disappeared, grain fleets stopped sailing. But not everywhere. Scattered across the fading empire were small places that didn't rise or rebel. They simply stayed. No grand monuments, no generals, no headlines. Just people. Farming, fixing roofs, keeping routines. Their survival came not from strength or wealth, but from invisibility. These were not the famous cities of antiquity. They weren't capitals or military hubs. They were the Vici and Oppida, modest towns nestled in valleys, built along minor roads, or hidden behind low hills. Some had been way stations. Others were agricultural satellites. A few had once held small garrisons. But when Rome's web of administration unraveled, these places didn't collapse. They withdrew. The key to their endurance was simplicity. Towns that depended heavily on imperial infrastructure, grain shipments, aqueducts, long-distance trade, were vulnerable. But places that grew their own food, drank from nearby springs, and traded only with neighboring villages were already adapted to scarcity. When the empire's scaffolding was pulled away, these towns felt less of a jolt. They had never leaned on it heavily. One such town, studied by archaeologists in the foothills of the Apennines, offers a striking example. Known in Roman records as Castrum Vallum, it had been a minor supply post during the 3rd century, surrounded by farmland and a modest stone wall. By the early 5th century, it no longer appeared in imperial records. No taxes were collected, no officials visited, but it didn't vanish. Instead, it became quieter. The stone wall was patched with timber and mud. The forum was slowly converted into a communal grazing yard. A small church emerged near the remains of the Principia. People repaired what they needed, ignored what they didn't. Coins stopped arriving, so they bartered. The post road to the nearest city crumbled, but they already knew the way by heart. Inside one of the excavated homes, a hearth had been rebuilt 3 times, each smaller than the last. The family living there no longer needed a large dining room or guest quarters. They didn't host officials or entertain passing traders. They stayed warm, stored grain, and raised goats, and they endured. In Gaul, a similar pattern played out. Along the old Roman roads near the Loire River, dozens of settlements shrank into tight clusters. Stone villas were replaced by wooden longhouses. Tiles were reused. Wells were shared. Community decisions were made in chapels or under trees. The Latin inscriptions faded, but the boundaries of the fields remained the same. A bishop writing from Tours in the late 5th century described a village that still held Roman-style festivals, but without the statues or processions. They gathered, he wrote, because they always had. No one remembered why, but they brought bread, wine, and songs. The form had lost its name, but not its rhythm. This slow forgetting was part of survival. The more a town clung to imperial expectations, tax quotas, bureaucratic forms, distant governors, the more fragile it became. But the towns that let go, that adapted, that made peace with being forgotten, they lasted, some for centuries. 1. Village in Hispania, later called Aldea Vieja, survived nearly unchanged from the 3rd to the 7th century. Its secret? Location and humility. Nestled in a shallow valley, it avoided major invasions, stayed out of political rivalries, and maintained a single dirt path to the nearest market. It had no amphitheatre, no large temple, no visible wealth. When raiders passed through the region, they often missed it entirely. In many of these towns, authority became personal. There were no appointed governors or tax collectors. The elder with the largest storehouse or the farmer with the best harvest became the default leader. Disputes were resolved by conversation, not decree. Decisions were made communally or with the guidance of the local priest. Churches played a growing role. Not grand basilicas, but small stone or wooden chapels where villagers gathered for both worship and coordination. The priest might keep records of births and debts. He might negotiate with traveling merchants. He might advise the planting of grain based on old Roman calendars still scratched into stone. Language shifted too. Classical Latin gave way to local dialects. Legal phrases became folk sayings. A property line might be described by trees and stones, not written titles. And yet, the sense of continuity remained. People still called themselves Romani, even if they no longer knew who the emperor was. In some towns, Roman tools were passed down like heirlooms: a bronze scale for weighing grain, a rusted plowshare, a ring with an imperial seal. These weren't displayed with reverence. They were used, modified, repaired. The past was not a museum. It was a toolbox. This quiet persistence meant that the shape of Rome lingered, even where its name faded. The grid of fields, the location of wells, the outline of roads, all preserved choices made centuries earlier. A child born in 500 CE might grow up drinking from the same spring as his ancestors in 200 CE, walking the same path to gather firewood, harvesting grain from the same hillside. Without ever reading a map, he was living in the skeleton of an empire, and yet he wouldn't call it survival. It was just life. These towns did not aspire to rebuild Rome. They had no ambitions of empire. They were not nostalgic. They were practical. They worked with what they had. They moved forward, not by innovating, but by holding still. And that stillness, that refusal to be swept into collapse or conquest, became its own kind of strength. They were too small to conquer, too poor to loot, too quiet to notice, and so they remained, the last lights in the west. When the empire left, the clocks didn't stop. They just ticked more quietly. In the small towns that outlived the Western Roman Empire by staying invisible, time itself changed shape. No longer measured by imperial edicts or bureaucratic deadlines, life began to follow rhythms older and slower than Rome. The sun, the seasons, and the steady cycles of planting and harvest. The official Roman calendar, with its layers of consular dating, imperial anniversaries, and civic observances, had once structured life across the empire. Even in modest towns, people knew what year it was by who held office in Rome or Constantinople. But with the collapse of central authority, those reference points vanished. And so, these towns began to keep time in their own ways. One village in northern Gaul, known today through archaeological remains and a handful of 6th century letters, shifted from dating events by emperors to marking them by natural signs. The year of the dry spring, the year the river froze early, the year Father Linus died. These were not less accurate, only more local. Memory replaced measurement. Births, deaths, good harvests, and fires were remembered not by exact dates, but by who remembered them. When your uncle was a boy, or just before the apple, trees bloomed early, became valid, useful ways to organize time. In the absence of Roman civic calendars, the church's liturgical year stepped in. Festivals like Easter and Saints' Days became anchors in the new calendar. Even towns with no formal clergy marked the weeks by these recurring observances. The Feast of St. Martin, for instance, might coincide with local livestock slaughter, not because of theology, but because that's when the cold set in and meat needed preserving. These observances brought continuity. They didn't demand a deep understanding of doctrine. They provided a rhythm. People fasted, feasted, and rested in ways that gave life a shape. In many villages, the ringing of a bell, or in poorer places, the beating of a wooden board, marked the call to gather, the end of work or the beginning of prayer. Law, too, began to change shape. With Roman courts and officials gone, most villages developed customary systems of justice. There were no written codes, no appeals. Instead, decisions were made through conversation, mediation, and memory. In one village near the old Roman town of Segedunum, disputes were settled in the open, beneath a tree said to have stood since before the last emperor. 3 elders sat together, one from each of the main extended families, and listened to both sides. Theft might be repaid in grain or labor. Injury might be settled with livestock. A refusal to accept the elders' ruling could lead to exclusion from communal grazing or collective harvest work, punishments more feared than a distant jail cell. This system worked because everyone knew everyone. Reputation mattered more than law. A man who had lied once might find fewer trading partners. A family that gave freely during hard winters might receive help without asking in the next. Justice became a social contract, not a written one. The concept of property also changed. Roman deeds and boundary stones still existed. Some even survived as reused building material. But few villagers could read Latin anymore. Land passed through inheritance, through verbal agreements, and through use. If you worked a field for years and no one challenged you, it was yours. Not legally, but practically. In some cases, monks helped maintain a shadow of Roman record-keeping. A small monastery might preserve a book of local landholders, a mix of Latin scribbles, vernacular notes, and drawings. These were not enforceable by any court, but they served as memory aids. And in a world where memory was law, that was enough. What also survived and evolved was the habit of public responsibility. In Rome, certain duties had been formalized: street cleaning, bridge repair, market regulation. In the villages that endured, these tasks remained, but were shared. If the bridge washed out, everyone helped fix it. If the path to the church grew overgrown, someone cleared it. Not because they were ordered to, but because it was understood. The idea of civic life, of working together to sustain a place, had outlived the empire that codified it, and these habits extended to care for the dead, harvest rituals, and seasonal gatherings. A village might still hold something like a census, but instead of counting heads for taxes, they made lists of who would bring bread to the spring festival, who would host the winter meal, who needed help repairing a roof. Some Roman practices were preserved accidentally. An old well might still be called by its Latin name, even if no one knew why. A path might be known as the Emperor's Road, though no emperor had walked it in centuries. The terms remained, stripped of politics, but heavy with continuity, and in that continuity lay a quiet kind of identity. The people in these towns no longer served Rome, but they remembered it, not in speeches or monuments, but in routines. They washed their hands before meals. They greeted guests with bread. They measured things in handfuls and steps, as their grandparents had. A child born in such a town would grow up among Roman ruins, walk on Roman roads, and drink from Roman cisterns, but he would never hear Latin spoken fluently. He might never see a coin with a real emperor's face. And yet, his world was Roman in shape, if not in name. This paradox of forgotten origins and remembered habits is what made these towns resilient. They didn't need the empire to be present. They only needed the past to be familiar. They lived in its shadow, but not under its weight. And because they claimed nothing, they lost nothing when empires changed. They carried the soul of Rome, not in titles or temples, but in tools and time. And so, as the centuries turned, these invisible towns kept moving, not forward or backward, but onward, steady, modest, and awake to the seasons. By the 7th century, many of the towns that had once belonged to Rome no longer thought of themselves that way. And yet, in everything from how they planted wheat to how they welcomed strangers, they carried Rome forward. Quietly, unconsciously, faithfully. They hadn't set out to preserve history. They had no mission, no libraries of scrolls, no marble plaques declaring themselves the last Romans. They had simply continued living, and in doing so became something rare. Memory made into routine. It's in these forgotten towns that the deepest layers of legacy lie. Not the bold monuments or the legal codes, but the gestures that never needed to be written down. The way a village square was cleared for gatherings. The way stones were laid in a particular grid. The way a child's first steps were measured against a doorway worn smooth by generations. In the Umbrian hills, one such settlement, unnamed in written records but uncovered by archaeology, shows no signs of grand Roman buildings. But its walls follow the curve of a former Roman castrum. Its fields are still divided by ditches laid out 200 years earlier. Pottery styles evolve, but the placement of hearths stays the same. The town didn't preserve Rome's greatness, it preserved its usefulness. This kind of legacy is invisible to history books, but not to daily life. A woman grinding flour with a worn stone using a rhythm her grandmother used. A boy taught to sweep the threshold at sunrise. A gathering of families beneath an old oak tree, not because it was sacred, but because it had always been the place for decisions. In many of these communities, even the sense of place was inherited. A hill where smoke curled each morning, a path shaded just so by elder trees, a sound of running water through a cracked Roman pipe. These became reference points, and when new arrivals came, whether pilgrims, wanderers, or displaced neighbors. They were shown not to a governor's hall but to the well, the oven, the tool shed. This is how you live here, they were told. And so the memory passed on. What these towns truly carried wasn't power. It was structure, a way of organizing time, land, labor, and cooperation. Without inscriptions, they remembered that someone must clean the watercourse. Someone must help mend the roof. Someone must carry the injured to the healer. And someone must be first to light a fire after a storm. In an old chapel near the Rhone, a 6th century inscription reads simply, "We built this together after the great snow." There is no mention of names, no patron, no bishop. Only a sentence, scratched into stone by someone who likely could not read much else. It is a sentence Rome would have understood. Even language, which changed so quickly elsewhere, shifted more slowly in these places. Vulgar Latin phrases endured in corners of Gaul and northern Italy, not because anyone enforced them, but because they fit the old routines. In kitchens and workshops, people still used words like fornax for oven, mensura for measuring scoop, and vicinus for neighbor. These were not archaisms, they were tools. And yet, these communities didn't resist change. They simply absorbed it at their own pace. When Christianity spread, the chapels were built on old shrines or near existing gathering points. The feast days replaced older festivals. The new merged with the familiar, layer by layer. There was no sharp line between pagan and Christian, Roman and post-Roman. Only a gentle turn. This blending preserved a kind of cultural muscle memory. A sense that life could be organized, that hardship could be shared, that cooperation was not an invention, but a given. And in a time when much of the former empire was ruled by warlords, fragmented by invasion, or swept by famine, these small habits of order mattered. One historian later described such towns as accidental archives, not because they recorded history, but because they became it. Some of these villages grew, others vanished. A few left ruins beneath later cities, their outlines now mapped by modern archaeologists. But many simply continued, becoming medieval, towns without ever realizing they had crossed a threshold. To them, there was no before and after Rome. There was only here and still. In a valley in Provence, a community that had once been a Roman posting station became a way stop for pilgrims. The road narrowed, the station decayed, but the habit of welcoming travelers endured. The house nearest the path always left water outside. It was not written in any rulebook, but it continued. And in these quiet continuities, something more than survival was preserved. Meaning was preserved, the kind that isn't shouted in senate halls or carved in triumphal arches, but passed in bread, in shelter, in memory. In an early medieval sermon copied by a monk in Lombardy, the speaker reminds his flock to keep the peace as the Romans once did, not with swords, but with shared grain. The congregation likely had never known a true Roman. But the phrase meant something. Peace meant food, and food meant sharing. That was Rome too. The fall of an empire is easy to name. It's the date in a book, the battle on a map, the emperor, deposed. But the survival of an empire, not its rule, but its pattern, is harder to see. It happens in places too small to notice, and in actions too humble to record. A man sharpening a plough, a woman teaching her daughter to spin, a neighbor showing another how to patch a roof with moss because the tiles are gone and no more are coming. These are not Roman acts, and yet, in a way, they are. And so the question, left floating in the evening smoke of a cooking fire in a town with no name and no glory, is not, did Rome fall? It is, if a people live the values of an empire long after its banners fade, was it ever truly gone? And so, as we close our journey through the quieter corners of the Roman Empire's final centuries, through the vanishing grain, the hollowed ledgers, the fading walls, the hidden trades, and the towns that forgot nothing but their names. We're left with something more durable than stone, not triumphs, not defeats, but habits, not emperors, but neighbors, not battles, but agreements, not collapse, but adjustment. This wasn't the fall of Rome as we often imagine it. It was the echo of Rome continuing to shape the world long after its voice had gone quiet. If you've listened this far, perhaps your eyes are heavy now. Perhaps your thoughts are somewhere between a crumbling aqueduct and a hidden valley path. That's all right. These stories were never meant to keep you awake, only to keep you company. And if any part of tonight's journey lingered with you, a detail, a name, a feeling, I'd love to know. Let me know where in the world you're listening from, which hour of the night has found you here. And if you'd like to travel through more quiet corners of forgotten history, feel free to join us again. There's always another story, always another quiet ruin still standing. Until next time, sleep well, and may your roads be steady, even if they're no longer paved.